Hi everybody, John back again. So yeah, a few weeks ago, maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, James Griffiths made a nice video about his personal history of reading about music. It's quite a nice little video that he did, and I know that James is at the moment in the process of moving. So all I can imagine is that he's sort of in the process of emptying shelves and shifting boxes of stuff that perhaps he hasn't looked at for a long time, and maybe that's what sort of brought these things into his mind and prompted him to make the video. I've done a bit of that myself in the past. Moved quite a lot. I can't remember how many times I've moved houses. Well, there was a period where I seemed to be moving every year for a while, and you sort of have to go through bookshelves and paperwork and all sorts of stuff and put into boxes and shift it. And yeah, I've got a lot of things that I would have liked to have shown, but they're in boxes in my loft, far back in the eaves. So we'll just have to see how we get along. James spoke about a nice little book about, I think it was about Paul McCartney, that was left to him by the Tooth Fairy, which was, I thought, was a lovely way to start. I think James was quite young when that happened to him, but I can't go that far back. In fact, I'll even say that I didn't really start reading for my own pleasure until quite late. I think I would have been 14 or 15, I think. That's when I kind of discovered the joy of reading a novel whilst listening to music. I remember, to this day, I can't not listen to Duran Duran's Rio album, for instance, without imagining stuff going on in the land of Narnia, because I sort of read my way through the Narnia books, which is quite late, I suppose, to be reading those, but those are the ones I had to hand. And for me, Rio will always be the soundtrack to those books. But reading about music, I think it's fair to say that I probably started quite late with that as well. James showed the magazine Kerrang and spoke about how he used to read that. Now, I remember Kerrang. I didn't like it very much, and for good reason. The main art director of the magazine was a guy called Crusher Jewell, and he is sort of a graphic artist that made, for instance, some very garish record covers like these ones. And you'll see how, although he may make strong imagery that was perhaps appropriate for heavy metal of its day, he's not really a typographer, and some of the horrendous way he would set type, these ridiculous colours, and I just couldn't get along with that. And if memory serves me right, he was the art director of the Kerrang magazine, and he'd typeset it in a similar way to the way he would do the back of a record cover. I didn't like it. It was uncomfortable to read, and it felt more like a fanzine to me, which I just wasn't interested in. So I was much more interested in reading its main rival, which was Raw. Raw was, laid out a lot cleaner and just done much nicer, I think. And I felt that there was much more of a editorial approach to the way they wrote about music and stuff. And I used to read Raw. I remember, buying a copy when it came out when I was a student, and that was when I sort of really started getting into heavy metal and sort of hard rock. And in those days, you used to buy a magazine and you didn't have much else to do. You kind of read it from cover to cover. I had a lot of joy from Raw, and I learned a lot about rock music and the bands that were coming and going and that sort of thing. When I moved abroad to Sweden in the 90s, 93 I moved there, it was before the internet, and yeah, I was, for the longest time, I was starved of anything to consume in English. I mean, the local library was my best friend, I think, at the time on Leadinga, and there wasn't much television on that wasn't Swedish. There was a couple of programs on the TV. One of those was A Little House on the Prairie, and believe it or not, I used to rush home sometimes from Swedish lessons that you had to do when you moved to Sweden in the 90s. I used to rush home to catch Little House on the Prairie because it was the only thing on television that I could understand. Anyway, so I subscribed to Raw as well when I lived there, um, and yeah, if you wanted to buy a magazine, for instance, if I wanted to buy a copy of Raw in Sweden, it would cost me a lot of money because it was imported, and you had to pay a lot. So whatever the price of the magazine was, it was almost double by the time you, which made it very expensive. And so I subscribed, so it meant that it came to my door and it was cheaper. But even in those days, it wasn't very predictable when it would arrive. Sometimes, I'd go for a month or two and not see a single copy, and then two would arrive at the same time in the same post, that sort of thing. But it was good. I used to like the way, there was, at the time I can remember, there was the sort of thing going on where you had a lot of the big sort of bombastic cock rock bands like Whitesnake and all that sort of, and they were sort of taking the back seat to the grunge thing that was happening. I found that quite interesting. But then one day, I always remember this with horror. I remember one day through the post came this long-awaited Raw magazine, and like it was like the world had come to an end. It, for whatever reason, was no longer a hard rock magazine. Overnight, it had sort of become um, a Britpop magazine. Don't know why. I had no indication of that was going to happen. There was no explanation other than it was saying it's better now. I think this is the cover of the one that came through my door, and I looked at it and it was horrific. Like, where's all the stories about Guns N' Roses? Why is there nothing about Iron Maiden in here? Motorhead. What's happening? It was full of pictures of younger boys, I suppose, with short haircuts, mop tops, and with names like Oasis and what are the rest of them called? Blur, all that sort of stuff. And I knew nothing about these. Britpop wasn't happening and didn't happen in Sweden. So it was all completely alien, and I couldn't understand what had happened. I think really what had happened had been some kind of big corporate collapse, and to save on something, they tried to sort of peddle it into a more popular magazine of music that was sort of happening at the time. And yeah, that was really, I always remember that day. It was just like I said, the world had come to an end. It's like heavy metal had ceased to exist. Um, so after that, there was quite a long period, I'm sure, where there was no sort of dedicated, as far as I could tell, no sort of dedicated um, hard rock magazine. I think there was Metal Hammer happening somewhere, but that never really interested me. I liked hard rock and heavy metal up to a certain level, like the thrash bands. But anything further than that, I just didn't really enjoy. Still don't. And it seemed to me that Metal Hammer was catering to people that was interested in everything from Metallica and Slayer upwards, so all the way up to Napalm Death and sort of those type of bands. And so yeah, that was really not my thing. And for the longest time, I didn't read anything that was sort of happening. And then one day, Classic Rock came out. My best friend Tim, told me about this magazine, and he and I were sort of really enthusiastic about it when it came out. Again, it was one of those magazines, you got it and you read it from cover to cover, twice, three times maybe, because it was expensive, but it was worth it because we were kind of starved of music, articles about things coming out and that had happened in the past and this sort of thing. What was interesting about Classic Rock, here's a copy of, there's an old copy of an issue here. what was interesting about it when it came out was it addressed, you know, a lot of the things that were happening in the world of rock music when we were fanatical about it, but it seemed to be doing it in a kind of retrospective way, almost suggesting that the music that we liked in the 90s or 80s and 90s was now sort of classic. It was now something that had sort of gone past its best, or it was over the hill, and now it's time to reflect on how good it was. Um, I think that's really what it was setting out to do, which was a bit of a, you know, a bit of a shocker to you. You know, when you start to realise, oh, is that the thing that I like is now kind of old hat and old fashioned? Um, yeah, so that was strange. Because the magazines were expensive, you know, you couldn't just go out and buy whatever magazines you felt like unless you had lots of money, and you know, normally you didn't. And Sweden's quite an expensive country to live in. Pay a lot of tax on things, and yeah, music books, magazines or books that are published in English, they've been imported, so you've got to pay for the price of that. So there were magazines that were quite of interest, like Mojo. James listed a few of these. There was a Q magazine, Uncut. I remember there was one called The Word that I quite enjoyed reading. Now and again, I used to get on a plane, Ryanair flight, and fly from Skavsta in Nyköping in Sweden, and it would fly me all the way to Stansted, which is quite close to where I'm from in Essex. And I go home, stay with my parents maybe for a week or something over Christmas or some holiday or something like that. And on Chelmsford Market, there's a stall at the top that sells books and magazines and old periodicals. And they don't have them now, sadly, anymore. I mean, you can buy cooking magazines or, you know, Women's Weekly or whatever, but they used to have big shelves full of past issues of um, Q magazine. The Word was always there, Uncut and Mojo, and they used to sell them off something like £3 for £1, which seemed incredibly cheap. And I didn't care if it was maybe 3 months out of date. it's journalism that I hadn't read. It was stories that I hadn't been exposed to yet. So I used to go and I'd spend maybe £5 or £6 and have a big stack of magazines to read on the plane on the way home, but also, it was too much to read on the plane, but also, you know, once I got home I would work my way through these magazines. I did that many times because it was quite cheap in Ryanair. Sometimes it was as little as £1. It seemed ridiculous just to fly over. And so yeah, I got happy memories of reading Mojo and Q magazine like that. And because I didn't read them sort of on a regular basis, I never really worked out what their niche was, who they're aimed at. I'm sure somebody that read them more regularly could tell you, oh, this was aimed at a sort of a younger audience, or this was aimed at the alternative rock audience. They all just kind of melded into one, really, and I was quite happy just to be able to read the stories, read the album reviews, things like that, you know, quite good fun. So that's my story of sort of reading periodicals. Oh, then I will say, in recent years, I've picked up on this sister publication to classic rock. It's called Prog. Um, yeah, I was quite excited about this when it first came out, but after a while I sort of lost interest, and now I nearly never buy it because, well, there's only so much you can write about prog, I think. I mean, they can write over and over again about Genesis, ELP, all this sort of stuff. Yeah, okay, they've done it, and they've done it to death. And there are some newer prog bands that they write a little about, not very much, but I find that they generally fill that magazine with bands like, you know, extreme hard rock bands that I don't really consider as being progressive or prog. It feels a bit like, you know, they labour to sort of chuck some artists into that category because then they can write about it in a magazine. Um, Yeah, maybe I'm just old-fashioned. I don't know. Maybe I, but I find I can read about a band, think, oh, this sounds interesting, and then I look them up and listen to them, and it sounds like, I don't know, Nirvana, and I think, well, that's not prog. It's not the way I see it anyway. There's no Mellotron in most of them or anything like that. So I'll read it occasionally if there's sort of a good cover story on it, but I don't spend my money on it anymore. Now, books. I read a really good book, um, and I can't find it. It's in a box in the eaves somewhere. And this is probably one of the best books that I've read about music. Um, and if you haven't read this one, I recommend it. It's so good. It's not really a novel as such. It's more of a this guy writes his sort of story about record collecting, um, and he talks to various other people about it, and he tells lots of really interesting anecdotes about some of the adventures they get up to, some of the amazing finds they have, the situations they get into. Anyone that collects records or enjoys collecting music or likes going, hunting for those lost gems that you haven't discovered yet, that sort of thing, look out for this book because it's really good. I haven't read it for years, and now, probably because I can't find my copy, and now because I'm talking about it, I really feel like I want to read this again. It's been a while since I read it last, but it is a fantastic book. So look out for this one. I can't even remember the guy that wrote it, or even the name of what the book is, but I know which one I'm talking about, and I've probably written it here or something like that. When I started getting to know James Griffiths on the vinyl community, we spoke a lot about different, books and things like that, and he really recommended this one, and he spoke about this in his video, um, Lost in Music by Giles Smith. And yeah, it's really good. It's funny. It's a funny book, but it's interesting. It's sort of kind of written in a very sort of understated way. This guy talks about his music interest, how it developed, and some of the funny things that happened to him. He rubs shoulders with Captain Sensible and one or two other people. He sort of name drops in here. Comes in situations where who's that singer in that Britpop band, Blur. That's who it was. Um, he gets in some connection with Blur's singer's mother or something if they live locally to him. He gets into some close encounters with Nick Kershaw. It's really good and it's really funny. He makes really sort of interesting observations, and that's a great book. So when I read this, and James and I were sort of talking a lot about sort of music and things in the early days when he was, I can remember when he had like 50 subscribers or something like that. Yeah, we spoke quite a lot about books. There was another book that we kind of attempted to get into to read. I can't remember what that was called now. I'll put the name of the book or the thumbnail up here. I didn't like that. I read it about one third through and just immediately lost interest. It was really badly written. It wasn't really about record collecting. It was about this prat of the protagonist, and he tried to use record collecting and his sort of luck of finding records as some sort of some way to kind of beef up his credibility or something like that. But it didn't work for me. It was just silly. Now, I didn't know this, but there's a whole series of these. I think there's about 4 or 5. And my wife actually bought me the whole series, I think a couple of years ago for Christmas. And I didn't tell her, but I thought, I'm just not going to read these. So I've passed them on to a charity shop since then. But hey, that's that book. I didn't enjoy it very much. And what else is there? Well, I've read this one. This was an interesting book. John Peel, Margrave and the Marshes, his autobiography. And it's a bit dusty, it's been in the bookshelf. That's really good. Oh, I was thinking of the dust. Embarrassing. Um, yeah, it's a sort of really revealing. You know, talks about his intro to music. You know how he the early stars that really inspired him, and he sort of writes about them really intimately. You know, like you know, all the music. If you think John Peel must have listened to and come across and you know, had his hand in, he writes about Lonnie Donegan, like you know, a Beatles fan would write about Paul McCartney or John Lennon. He sort of really sort of describes um, what it meant to him. You know, when these things first come out. He talks about his experience in school. Some of it's quite, what should we say, quite dark. Some pretty dodgy things happened to him at school, which is quite shocking when you read it, because he has a kind of a very dry, satirical way of speaking, doesn't he? Well, he did anyway. And he writes about some of these dreadful encounters in his school time in that similar way. Um, yeah, so yeah, interesting though, great book. Another autobiography I read is this one, um, Andy Taylor. I raised this now because I found this really interesting. You know, we know Andy Taylor as being the guitarist from Duran Duran. A lot of people dismiss Duran Duran, you know, because they were a popular pop band. Um, but you know, when they became famous, he left the UK, went to live in I think LA, I think, and he became great mates with um, Steve Jones from the Sex Pistols. He describes Steve Jones as a real sort of desperate case. Like essentially the way Andy Taylor describes him is like he was like a big kid with lots of money, and he would get himself into all sorts of incredible scrapes. Lived this completely wild, untamed life, and Andy Taylor, I think, felt quite sorry for him because he could see he's getting himself into dangerous places all the time, and there's no grown up to watch out for him. I think Andy Taylor kind of takes on that that role for a while, which was interesting. He talks about the crazy antics he gets up to with Rod Stewart. Rod Stewart lived abroad in there for a while, and yeah, Andy Taylor became big mates with him. They used to go on these wild clubbing nights and drunken parties. I can imagine Rod Stewart being a really cool guy to go out with. He just seems like that person to me. So it was interesting to hear that Andy Taylor did that. Who else did he write about? Oh, Robert Palmer. Just thought him as a really sort of gentlemanly type figure that Andy Taylor describes him as. Very sleek, very very chic and very cultured and everything like that. And I think he was impressed by that. And he talks about why he left Duran not just once but twice. You know, it's an interesting read, especially for Duran fans, but also for people generally that want to hear about musicians interacting together in their sort of private lives. He tells a story when he went to visit Ronnie Wood, and Ronnie Wood's very accommodating, working them in and this sort of thing. And of course, there's always this entourage around people like the Rolling Stones, I suppose. But then when Keith Richards turns up in the location, he kind of took a very sort of downward look at Andy Taylor because he didn't know who he was. And he just thought, oh, they've just come on to mooch off our cocaine sort of thing. That was obviously sitting around, and Andy Taylor never did anything like that. But yeah, it's an interesting story that he tells. Sadly, he's in the news just again recently, isn't he? Because he's got some kind of form of cancer, and yeah, he hasn't got long left. I think um, the article said that I read he's basically got about another 5 years left, or something like that. So that's really tragic. But it's a lovely book. Glad I read it, and definitely pull that out again one day in the future. Um, but in terms of reading, I read pretty slowly. I always have done. I guess I started quite late, like I said, in my teens, reading for pleasure. But once I discovered that and sort of found it, I read quite a lot. I just read very very slowly, and a book you know, just a thin novel can I can have to live with. I mean, something like this, for instance, you know, I can live with this for maybe three weeks, and I'll eventually get through it, and it's great because it's almost like it becomes part of my life for a few weeks. You know, a big thick book, something like this, can take much longer. But other books like this is an interesting one, Music Lover's Guide to Record Collecting. That takes me a bit longer. But also, I mean, I think sometimes books like this, you can use them a bit like reference books, kind of. You can just go in and you know, pick out stuff, and it's sort of structured in such a way that you can identify the bit that you want to read about at the time. That was a good book. I think when I started collecting seriously, things like this were really interesting to me. This is a nice book that I got a few years ago. A Visual History of the World's Greatest 250 Rock Acts. And it's structured in such a way that it tells you, the bit that I find really mostly interesting is how big certain artists are compared to others. You know, like for instance, we like to think, okay, this band is huge, this other band's big. How do they compare? Well, here they compare sort of record sales, and they put them in these little circles up here. Right, let's get that in the camera. And the bigger the circle has a you know a number there telling you how much they've sold. So if we find an album, let's say, let's find, all right, here, Fleetwood Mac. So the size of that circle, right, Rumours, is bigger than most of the circles that are in the book because it's sold so many copies. Compared to some of their other albums, the circles are smaller, the amount they sold is a lot less, and you can compare that with, let's say, Motley Crue. You can see how, yeah, popular band, sold a lot of records, but nowhere near in terms of what Fleetwood Mac sold. And it's surprising, you know, because you can compare a lot of artists in that way. They also do this thing where it talks quite thoroughly about different roles that people have had in the bands, how long they've played in the lineup, and who replaced them, that sort of thing. It's an interesting book. It says inclusive, engaging band history. Inclusive, engaging band histories chart the evolving lineups, sound, labels, and achievements of 250 of the greatest acts in rock era by Glorious Era. A peerless rock encyclopedia especially configured for the 21st century. The only other book I think I will sort of talk about to finish this off is I don't have my copy of it. I've got it around somewhere in a shelf, probably covered in dust because it's been a while since I read it. But it's the 1001 albums you must hear before you die. I've read that book, I think, 4 times, and each time I read it, there's something new. You know, I read it from cover to cover, and as you grow older, the more records you collect, the more music you listen to, you get a better insight into what it is you're hearing. You discover more artists, and you know your music taste develops. You know, I can remember the first time I read it, I didn't like soul music. I didn't know anything about jazz, and so I probably would have skipped past the pages where it was talking about artists that had released albums that were, you know, soul or funk or jazz. Now when I read it, I go back and it's like all of a sudden, oh wow, yeah, I like that artist. I know a bit of their music. What is it saying here? So you can, you know, as you grow and develop as a person, you can go through that book and it means a bit more each time. Also, there are records that maybe you've known for a long time, and it's interesting to see what's been written about it. But then maybe because your taste has changed, maybe you've decided you're not so keen on it. So what is being written about it in that book takes on a different meaning. So I recommend that for anyone that hasn't read that. But that's a truly great book, and one that I've enjoyed reading about. Okay, everybody, thanks very much. Thanks so much, James, for your first video. Really interesting, very thought-provoking, and sort of made me bring up a lot of memories of my time reading about music. Hope everybody else find this mildly interesting. Got some more videos coming up. Got lots of time on my hands coming up in the next few weeks, so I'm hoping to do loads of really good videos and perhaps get through my inbox and show all the records that I've been collecting over the past few months. Thanks very much, everybody. Check out my next video. Bye.